Ryan Olson, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Olson, is that Norwegian?
It is Norwegian, yes. So my grandparents,
Norwegian.
On my dad's side, great grandparents came over from Norway to Iowa a very long time ago.
No way. Awesome.
Yep.
Mine went to Minnesota. Yours went to Iowa.
Yes,
They were
the
being
Midwest.
a little different than the crowd. Yeah.
Yep.
The Midwest. Yeah. Same area. Well, cool. What is Ryan Olson? What's he doing? Who is he?
Yeah. So I'm Ryan. I joined Palo Alto Networks in 2014. I'm currently our vice president of threat intelligence. I lead the intelligence half of the Unit 42 team that we run here. If we go back a little bit in time, I left Iowa and went to grad school in Maryland. Went to Johns Hopkins University for a while and got a master's in security informatics. And while I was there, I did an internship with a company called iDefense that had just been acquired by VeriSign. This was 2006 or so. And they had this really interesting internship that was focused on all these areas of threat intelligence. iDefense was one of the very few private threat intelligence firms that existed at the time. And this internship was described as this rotation through malware analysis and vulnerability analysis and all these other things that I thought sounded just amazing. And when I performed the internship, I really sort of slotted into their malware team and started working there full time after I graduated. And that was the beginning of my career in malware analysis, which evolved into a career of managing people who analyze malware, and then eventually a team of people who focused on cybercrime and espionage analysis. And then I joined Palo Alto Networks in 2014 to launch Unit 42. And originally Unit 42 was part of our CSOs group. And we really had, a lot of companies when they start threat intelligence, they started as a product specifically, and they want to go and sell threat intel to people. And that was not the approach we were taking at the time. The approach we took was, let's look at all the data we're collecting and better understand adversaries and use that to do two things. One was improve our products. At the time, Palo Alto Networks was primarily a next-generation firewall company. It's evolved a lot in the last 8 years. But that was what we were working on doing, improving products by better understanding how attacks were occurring, and also sharing what we knew with people who could use it. So we started building all these relationships with the community, with other cybersecurity vendors, with law enforcement, so we could share what we knew with them. So fast forward, 7.5 years or so, Unit 42 has grown a lot. We've expanded to also add security consulting functionality to our group. And that all rolls up into my boss, Wendy Whitmore. And I still run the intelligence component of what we do, which is still has those similar missions around improving products, sharing with people outside the company, but also supporting all of our security consulting clients in their incident response engagements and everything else.
So you must have a very busy day then. What's a normal day look like for you if you're just managing all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, definitely stay busy. I mean, this week, the Log4j vulnerability has certainly been eating up a lot of our time. So for me, I don't get to do malware analysis myself anymore. So I'm not generally a threat intel analyst anymore. But as the leader of the group, a lot of my role is guiding that research forward and helping make decisions around where we should invest our time. There's always way more threats out there than we're going to be able to cover individually. So we have to make choices around what are the priorities for what we want to go and pursue. How's that going to benefit our customers and our clients? How's that going to benefit our team from a knowledge perspective for prediction of the future and things like that sometimes people rely on us for? And obviously all the things that come with being a people manager, managing, I've got, somewhere around 50 people who work for me. So that's a lot of folks hiring, staffing, budgets, all the things that come with sort of a leadership position.
Right. All those things that come with the leadership position, and then the Log4Shell comes.
Yeah.
What now that's happening, like today's the 14th of December, and that is hitting the fan.
Yep. It sure is.
In every way, shape, form. So when that happens, like what goes on your side of the fence?
Yeah, so let's see. When it was first reported Thursday night, I was on an airplane flying back from California. It was Thursday morning, I guess, when the tweets were happening. So the timeline around this is still being established. One of the team in our company who's focused on our threat prevention product picked it up and started writing signatures for it. So when I landed at 2 a.m. here in Virginia, where I live, we kicked off our war room, which basically was assembling all the people across the company who would be contributing to the effort, which is a wide swath of people, not just our, the product teams, of course, who are ensuring we have coverage for whatever the new threat would be for a war room, but also our internal information security teams, our communications groups to figure out what are we going to do, what do we need to say publicly about this. Our marketing teams certainly get engaged as well. Obviously, we're a vendor and we want to be able to talk about how we can help our customers and clients be successful. So it's really a whole company effort when we have a event like this. We have a tiering system for different types of events to say how significant is this and how large should our response be. And then we kick it off. And from there, lots of people who are way smarter than me get engaged and start doing the real work. I'm just the person who sort of pushes things along at that point.
Yeah, because it's a very complex picture for Palo Alto, right? Because you have products that need to be. How does it affect your product line? Is it you might be using some of those components in your products?
Yeah, so we've got to figure that out. Services.
Yeah.
We're a company as well, so we have lots of vendors who we buy software from.
Right.
We have to find out from them, and that's all on the InfoSec side. And then, of course, on the product side, what can we do to detect and block the vulnerability, both from a network perspective, from an endpoint perspective. This one in particular is extremely complicated from the perspective of this is a Log4j is software that's incorporated into lots of other software. And exploitation of the vulnerability just requires someone to be able to influence what content is being written to a log. And logs are written for all sorts of reasons containing user-supplied information like your username or other kinds of content that was entered. So there's just a lot of complexity to that to understand how significant is it, how can you block it, how effective can you be at blocking it. So yeah, it's a complicated one for sure, but we're getting really used to complicated things like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be the last the last time you're going to get off the plane and have to go to war room.
Nope, it happens. Yeah.
Right. But hey, Unit 42. We talked a little bit about just now, like collecting your info or collecting your intel and sharing your intel. There's a lot of. I would say you guys are probably the biggest security company in the world now, right?
At least by some perspectives, we are. Yes, we've got 80-something thousand customers. Yeah, do a lot of revenue, so we're a big company.
Yeah, and how does just your sheer size help you collect threat intelligence? And what are you doing? What do you think is cool around or unique about Palo Alto and Unit 42 in that regard? Yeah,
the volume of our telemetry has really exploded as the company has grown, as our customer base has grown, and the variety of the tools that we deploy has also grown. So when I joined in 2014, our primary telemetry source, threat telemetry, so what's happening out in the real world about attacks, was coming from our Wildfire product. And Wildfire is a sandbox, and it's a cloud-based sandbox, so we had lots of firewalls deployed. Customers could configure them to upload executables and PDFs and documents to Wildfire for analysis. So we would use that data as it was coming in to determine what's happening out there in the world. And of course, that was very useful to us, but it's a sort of limited purview because it's just malware. It's just things that are related to files. So over time, that has expanded as we started offering endpoint protection and cloud protection. All of those obviously come with a lot of data that's generated. And it's important that we protect that data. We don't want to expose any client information. The distilled sort of results of what are we detecting from a threat perspective, those are things that we can use to improve our products and better understand attackers. So that has expanded tremendously. We log hundreds of billions of events a day across millions and millions of endpoints, tens of thousands of firewalls. Like we have in enterprises all around the world in every industry. So it's a lot of data, and all of that we can consume and access it to hunt for things that may be of interest to us, either because there's a big new thing that we need to look for, or simply because we're trying to perform an investigation. So as an example, if we have an incident response client who comes in who's been compromised and they come to us and they need assistance, we can then take the IOCs that we find during that analysis and search across all of that data. Not only figure out, is this something that's impacting other people, but also if we can link those IOCs to other attacks that people have seen, we may be able to expand that and find other things that we should hunt for in that client's network to ensure that we have full coverage of the actual incident. So better data, better information about the threats really improves everything that we can do. And we just continue to, as the company grows and our customer base grows, we also grow all of that telemetry pool.
How quickly can you like see like things happening in the wild? What's the threshold for it, for you seeing something and you being like, oh, this is actually something new, or this is something we need to start, hunting for in other clients? Or like what triggers?
Yeah.
What makes a trigger go off?
So there's always something new. And the Palo Alto Networks approach is generally to try to automate protection as much as possible. So we don't want to spend a lot of time just sort of manually hunting for things. We want to take what we've learned and deploy that in a way that can automatically block and prevent attacks or trigger additional analysis. So for us, the threshold, it can vary a lot, and it can vary a lot depending on the analyst. So for example, we published a report about exploitation of some vulnerabilities in Zoho Manage Engine software. It was October when we published it. And in that case, the trigger for us was an incident response engagement we were looking into, where one of our Intel analysts who was engaged looked at it and just based off the techniques that we're using, felt like this was likely an APT attack. So we engaged additional resources at that point to assist the client, but also to better understand, could this be impacting other customers of ours? So we stepped back, we looked, we were able to identify other IOCs across our data set. We have great relationships with governments around the world. In this case, the US government was very interested because they had seen similar attacks against DoD, or at least DoD related organizations. And because of that, we were able to collaborate with them, see that this was broader than we could see with our own purview alone. And we actually published a report where NSA asked us to cite them in it because we had collaborated on that report, all in the goal of protecting people in general, and exposing these threats. When we shine a bright light on what a bad guy is doing, and NSA's got a really bright light, so does CISA, DHS, when they come out and say, hey, this is significant, it makes people stop and say, I need to take notice. And in the case of this Log4j vulnerability, if there wasn't as much attention on it right now as there is, people would not patch as quickly and more people would be impacted. And that's true at a smaller scale with lots of vulnerabilities on a regular basis.
How often do you mentioned the word APT or the letters APT?
Sure.
How often do you get pulled into political discussions and things like that at your level, and just having the insight that you have?
Yeah. As a company, we certainly have a lot of engagement with the government. I wouldn't say the conversations, at least from my perspective, are political. I normally get to treat things as the facts of the case, whatever it is we're looking at. We rarely make attributions to countries and say it was this government or this agency, largely because we frequently don't have that kind of visibility. We're normally seeing the attacks themselves, and oftentimes for that kind of attribution, you have to have an additional layer of insight that isn't available to us most of the time, at least from a confidence perspective. So we would instead give it a code name and say that we link all these things together under this code name based off the techniques that were used and the tools, but not necessarily go and say it was this country who launched that attack. So we can avoid those conversations simply out of sort of just being there to state the facts. That doesn't mean they don't happen. Cybersecurity is inherently a place where countries and individuals come up against each other. There's an opportunity for conflict, and with conflict, there's always a little bit of drama.
And you stay away from that drama if you can, right?
If the drama's productive, then it's worthwhile. But we're really focused on trying to make sure that our customers are safer. The internet as a whole is safer because it's such a critical asset for the entire planet. And I'm happy to shine a light on bad guys doing bad stuff and how they're doing it, if that helps other people go and say, this is how we can protect ourselves. I don't carry handcuffs. I don't sanction people. That's not my role. Other people can take that. And if our information is useful to them in that process, I'm extremely happy for them to use it, especially putting bad guys in jail.
Nice. I just want, it's very broad question, so good luck with this one. But you've been working with threat intelligence and everything within threat intelligence for, 15 years now. It was something like that, a long time. What do you think is cool and new? Is there anything that's cool and new that There's always something cool and new, but what I'll say, and I have to guide my team on this as well, is that for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, that sort of cool new circle gets smaller and smaller all the time because you've seen something in the past. But that doesn't mean when you're talking, if we're giving a briefing to a client or we're writing a report for the public,
it doesn't mean everyone has seen everything that we see. And we've got to sort of take a step back and realize that a lot of stuff is still really, really cool. It's hard to talk about bad guys. The stuff they do is cool, but it's interesting. It's technically interesting. And the business models that we've seen evolve in cybercrime especially are really, really interesting. And when there are new vulnerabilities, like this Log4j vulnerability, since it is so front of mind, this is it's really interesting the way that it can be exploited. Because I think a lot of people, you wouldn't normally think about the fact that just writing a log could potentially execute code. That is abnormal. But in this case, a feature is being exploited for that use case. And it triggers all sorts of crazy ideas around how could someone take advantage of this. If you have, logging, let's say there's a logging library that's now in your smart refrigerator because it was just included and all it's doing is logging, the door was open, the door was closed, something like that. Or maybe it logs maybe it logs calendar entries that you enter or something like that. Could you potentially enter some data that now triggers this vulnerability maybe in the refrigerator? I don't know if there's any fridges with Log4j in them, but it's very widely deployed, so it's possible. These are the kind of things that really do inspire a lot of new interest for me, at least, in sort of going through how could these attacks occur. But I'll say I'm most interested in evolution of adversary techniques, especially and probably as my career has changed more on the back end from an organizational business model perspective, more so than just new, let's say, evasion techniques for malware, which in the early part of my career was the thing I was most interested in. How are bad guys trying to stop me from doing my job was what I loved looking into the most then.
Right. And those techniques, is there anything you can mention that is works in a podcast form?
Sure. I mean, the ransomware business model has evolved a lot over the last 3 years. And it's really important to think of ransomware as a business model. It is a cyber extortion model. It's not a malware problem. You can perform a ransomware attack really without any kind of malware at all. The goal is to extort people by putting pressure on their organization. And that was originally, the first ransomware that we'd seen. I mean, ransomware has a very long history, but sort of the big kickoff of ransomware that started in sort of 2013 was all about encrypting individuals' files, then ask them for $500. At the time, that was a couple Bitcoin maybe, which is Bitcoin's worth a lot more than that now. But that model evolved to target organizations who had more money and more significant data. They weren't trying to get my grandma and encrypt her precious files of me anymore. Go for a bigger company. And then the companies evolved their strategy. Those who had effective backups and could easily restore those backups, they didn't really care about ransomware. They restore from a backup, just like that system was, fell in the river, whatever else it might be. But the business model evolved. The attackers wanted to apply more pressure, so they started seeking out the backups as well. And they started finding sort of the crown jewels of the company, and that allowed them to move up the sort of target stack. They could go for higher value targets, ask for larger ransoms. And then eventually they evolved to performing multiple forms of extortion. Sometimes we call it double extortion. There's triple and quadruple as well, but double extortion is generally we encrypt the files so that your business is shut down, which has a really public impact for people and puts a lot of pressure on them to pay. But we also steal the key files, and now we threaten to release them, which means no matter how good your backups are, if the data has been exfiltrated and I'm publicly telling the world, I have compromised company X and I have 20 gigs of their data, and here's some snippets of it, and I'm going to release it if they don't pay up in 7 days. That's a lot of new pressure, and it had nothing to do with encryption. It was all about espionage. There's some ransomware groups that are moving away from encryption entirely, just performing espionage, or data extraction for the purpose of extortion. And that's the ransomware in particular is a business model that is never going to go away because extortion is always valuable. Because if people have valuable data and you can get to it and you can either deny access to it or steal it, people will try to do that and extort you.
So you have like initial access brokers selling access to companies. If you think about the Log4Shell thing again, what's happening right now? Like, what kind of groups can you like imagine are actually like sitting there like, ooh, what should we do right now? Like, yeah.
So I think Log4Shell.
You might actually have insight into that.
Well, yeah, Log4Shell is interesting. I think the theme of 2021, at least from my perspective for attackers, was we had a few years where it seemed like the majority of compromises occurred through somebody infecting an individual user. So they'd send a phishing email, they compromise their credentials, they'd send malware attachment, compromise their system. It was going after a person sort of through those channels, sometimes through a web browser exploit as well. And 2021 has seen a pretty significant shift toward targeting externally facing infrastructure and vulnerabilities in that infrastructure. With the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities in March, that was massive from a response perspective because there were so many. I mean, they were reported in March. They were actually being exploited in January. So there was a long time where people were getting compromised through that before anyone knew about it. That was all about, hey, we've got to have Exchange public facing, partly because people were working from home a lot due to the pandemic, but also people generally had Exchange web services public facing. We started seeing attacks against VPNs as well, because once again, they have to be public facing. So any vulnerability into VPN, it's really hard to control who should be able to access it when you have your users wandering from Starbucks to Starbucks doing their work or at home, whatever it might be. We saw attacks against Atlassian Confluence in the same way later in the year. The Zoho vulnerabilities I was just talking about, and now this Log4j vulnerability. These are all about the infrastructure that we have public facing that is being exploited. And being exploited in each of those cases very quickly, either before the vulnerability was publicly known or very quickly after the vulnerability was publicly known, by a lot of types of adversaries, but especially those who don't necessarily have an immediate goal for the attack in mind, but they can scan the whole internet, find those devices that might be compromised, make a list of a few hundred companies they want to compromise, execute that, drop an implant there, and maybe do nothing with it right away. But the goal is get an implant in the network, move to be able to acquire credentials, and now come back anytime you want because you can log in through the VPN or whatever the tool might be. And that's not a pattern that's exclusive just to like an advanced, like an APT group. Like you could see that pattern from any kind of attacker. And I think with Log4j, what we've seen the last, since Thursday, but really Friday and Saturday, is people who are exploring what can they actually do with this vulnerability, because you don't necessarily know with the exchange vulnerabilities. You if you were to exploit it, you landed on an Exchange server, and you know what's on an Exchange server. You know generally how it's deployed. Like you have a good concept of what to do. You want to drop a web shell, or you want to move into the environment from it. But with this, there's so many places that Log4j could be executing. You may be just sort of sending test bubbles out to find out what is actually vulnerable. Where am I even executing when I run my JDNI command? When that gets executed, where is it going? And I think that's what we've been seeing the most of the last few days. And we'll see some very quick opportunistic attacks. Already we've seen a couple botnets who are picking it up, who are used for primarily DDoS attacks. Bitcoin miners as well. There's been some evidence, or at least reporting, that there might be a few ransomware cases as well, but I don't think we've worked any yet. But this vulnerability is going to have a really long tail. It's going to take a long time for people to fully patch it. So I'm sure the more sophisticated actors are performing the same kind of probing to understand what is the best way for them to use this. Because the last thing you want to do, if you really want to establish long-term access to a network, is to be really noisy about your attack. You want to be quiet and have that access for a long time. SolarWinds was a great example of that. That attack was very long-term and slow and quiet, which meant the adversary was able to probably achieve a lot of the goals that they set out, simply because they had access to so many networks for so long. So this isn't a vulnerability where you need to take advantage of it in the first moments. You're going to have a good amount of time for the people who don't properly deploy protections.
Yeah, so you just basically, the initial access brokers, of course, they're interested in it, but you also have other groups doing like crypto mining and stuff like that. There's a lot of groups. How many different groups are there that are in the cybercrime market, if you had to put them like that?
That's a really hard question. I've had so many conversations about this that are, and people always pick different numbers because it depends on how you define the group. It depends on exactly how you do it. But there's, in the hundreds to thousands potentially range. And that could be very small actors who, are just launching maybe a crypto mining attack, all the way up to larger groups who are launching really sophisticated attacks. But they come and go. They change over time. Like an individual who's doing performing cybercrime activity, maybe their initial access broker, they may change what they're doing. Initial access brokers also make it really confusing because you can have one broker who's working with a ransomware gang over here, and then maybe they go and they work with this one over here. So your attribution circle around how did this actor act is now merging across these multiple groups. So it makes it especially complicated for ransomware attribution. So luckily with ransomware, most of the time the gang tells you their name with the ransom note. So we can normally just sort of key off of that. But you won't necessarily have good data on for that group for all the various brokers they're working with.
A conversation I had at lunchtime was I wonder what the really scary people are doing right now, like the APTs, like they were like talking about how if everybody was looking there and focusing on that, I would do something totally else. There's something totally different. You agree with that? Or
I mean, the thing about
have you seen that maybe
in days like this when a lot of people are really focused on Log4j, it's not like everything else stops. All the ransomware attacks that weren't exploiting this vulnerability, they're still happening. All the general spam, the phishing attacks, everything, it just sort of continues at this baseline. It's not like there's some sort of like limited supply of attacker ability. I guess there is a limited supply, but everyone doesn't just sort of shift their focus over there. So it certainly is, distracting techniques are certainly a regularly used tactic to say, we know that a security team is going to be busy with this thing over here, so we have an opportunity to go and come through the back door over here. DDoS attacks are one of the mechanisms that a lot of actors have used simply to distract a security team or the IT team, depending on who you're working with. So they're focused entirely over here at the moment when you're launching your more stealthy attack on the other side. But those are occurring all the time. So I'm sure there is an opportunity for someone to take advantage of the amount of attention that's being paid to Log4j right now. That doesn't mean it doesn't deserve the attention. If your attention on it gets it patched, that's going to save you a lot. But I'm sure that's a good distraction for at least some adversaries.
Ooh, distraction attacks. Interesting. I've never really had that conversation with anybody. You must see a bunch of those all the time, I guess.
I wouldn't say we see them all the time, but it's not uncommon as a tactic. And it happened, I don't think it's as common today as it was. There was a period of time where DDoS attacks in general were just a massive challenge every single day. Back when we think back, I don't know, 10-ish years to the days when Anonymous was sort of in their heyday and everyone was freaked out by the fact that a guy in a Guy Fawkes mask might take down their entire network using a botnet of people running a software they downloaded from a website and just typed in the domain. Like, that was a different time. That was what the fire drills that we had then were really about. Hey, what's this hacktivist group going to do tomorrow? And at the same time, a DDoS attack, you could scare someone into taking action simply by threatening that DDoS attack. So at the time, we also saw cybercrime actors and others take similar tactics up. They would launch a DDoS attack at the same time from a distracted perspective. And that drove the industry in general to prepare better for DDoS attacks. Now there's way more bandwidth available, and there's way more anti-DDoS services, both from a product perspective as well as just a bandwidth absorption perspective. And ISPs also got better at this. So DDoS attacks are less of a concern now than they were before, just because people can better prepare for them.
Right.
Still a distraction, though.
All distraction, yeah. So what are you looking forward to in the future? Do you have any cool things that you want to mention, or
Here's what I'd say just generally about threat intelligence. The value of threat intel, as I've interpreted it since probably the midpoint of my career when a smarter man than I said it to me, is about helping people make better decisions about their security posture. And that could be proactively or it could be retroactively. So what can you use the data insight that you have to help a security team make a better choice? So that could be at the point of really simple, should we allow traffic to this IP address or not? That's a really simple one where an IOC, an indicator, an IP address, or a domain, whatever, would enable you to make a technical choice at that moment. It could also move up the stack and say, when you have an incident that you're dealing with, that decision point of, is this a ransomware actor? Is this a sort of just maybe a hacktivist attack? We don't see as much any of those as we did. Or is this an APT actor? It may warrant a different response from your IR team. In either case, you want to eradicate them. But if it's an actor that has a pattern of establishing long-term access to the network, they've been in the network for 2 months, you probably need to take a different tactic in your incident response than otherwise. So part of that is having that insight into what is this threat that you're dealing with. Our telemetry can help people understand that when merged with what we know from our intel team. So we use that telemetry to build a better profile of an actor. We may use indicators from the incident response case to point to indicators we've seen elsewhere that connect back to say, we know the pattern of this group. And that helps that IR team make a better decision. It could also move all the way up to the stack from a strategic perspective. And we don't work as much in this space. Well, strategic can mean a lot of things. It can go all the way up to like, should this company should we invest in buying this other company? And maybe threat intel is going to be helpful to you around, the location of the country or its connections from a political perspective. Those things can be a value in threat intelligence, but it could also help guide decisions around investment and security tooling. You may, looking out at maybe the trend of this year, let's say maybe one trend of this year that I described before is these attacks on public-facing infrastructure. Maybe that informs a CISO to say, I need to invest in a web application firewall, or I need to invest in a different VPN solution, whatever that might be. That knowledge is going to help them make a better decision in the overall security of their network. And our data, the telemetry that we have, is all about informing someone who can interpret it to help somebody make a better decision. And that can pass through an expert in my team, or it could be just there's intel operators in all sorts of large companies. Like not a lot of companies have large intel teams, but when you get to the top, they absolutely do. And the more data they have available, the better that they can help their leadership make better decisions.
You must have a lot of very creative, analytical people with lots of digital corkboards everywhere.
I remember a few years ago when Palo Alto Networks was moving much more into cloud security at the time. And I was talking to someone about the kill chain, because we like to use kill chain methodology and other forms to sort of model out how an attack occurs. And they were saying that the kill chain, for a cloud attack versus a non-cloud attack, they're like, it's the same kill chain, though. They've got to go through that. And to give an example, I was like, I got a lot of analysts out here. And if you were to go to the AWS catalog of services, you can open it up and look, and it's tons of them. It was tons of them at the time as well, and say, what role does AWS Lightsail play in the kill chain? They would say, I don't know what that is. And that's a skill set gap. Like and you might be able to quickly interpret that and say, oh, it's this version of this technology. I can understand that. But the cloud is inherently different from how people are used to running applications. You now have these distributed services where your primary controls are, how do I configure it and how do I do access control? That's really different than when you just had a data center where you could stick a firewall in front of it and say, let's block all the traffic. Like now you may have that ability as well, but you may not have it. It just depends on how things connect together. And that requires evolution of thought for an intelligence analyst and for a security analyst in general, in thinking about the components that actually make up both their risk profile, like the architecture and their attack surface, as well as their protections that they can put in front of it.
Well, Unit 42, don't panic.
Don't panic.
In the back of don't panic. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I can tell that you come highly recommended. So you must be doing a great job as leader. Your friends in Norway, super appreciative for them getting you here. I'm super appreciative of you taking your time out of your extremely overly busy day.
Happy to do it.
Overly busy week. So, Mr. Olson, you're welcome to come visit the motherland whenever you'd like.
I'd be happy to. Thanks,
Looking
Robby.
forward to that.
Yep.
Take care, Ryan.
Thank you.
Ciao.